G'day folks, my name is Rob. Welcome back to another F1 Fantasy video. Today we are looking at my race week preview and final thoughts ahead of the Azerbaijan Grand Prix this weekend. There is so much to get through in this video. I'm actually re-recording it because there's been a lot of news in the last couple of hours at the time of recording around Logan Sargeant, Ollie, Bearman, Gavin Magnussen, and their standing in the F1 fantasy game for this weekend. So we've got a lot to get through. I want to kick things off with Logan Sargeant first and foremost because it's been a bit of a sticking point in the F1 fantasy community lately. I've got a little chart on the screen here, which I will draw your attention to momentarily. But first of all, I want to obviously re-reference this Motorsport article that called out Logan Sargeant's place in F1 Fantasy earlier this week. There was an outreach made by Motorsport to F1 to determine whether or not Logan Sargeant would have a place in the game. I'll pin this article again in the comments of this video if you haven't yet had a chance to read it, but I will highlight this sentence in particular, that Motorsport did reach out to F1 for a comment. They said the issue would be addressed ahead of the Azerbaijan Grand Prix. This is Wednesday when I'm recording this video, and at this point in time, there is now an update on Logan Sargeant as well as an add of Ollie Bearman to the game. So we're going to get through all of that good stuff right away because it has been a very controversial topic in F1 fantasy circles lately. So we will go straight back to this diagram, and the first thing I will direct your attention towards is the box in the top left-hand corner of your screen where it has Logan Sargeant's driver card for the weekend, now with a tag that says driver is inactive and not classified penalty points will apply for this weekend. You can see this when you go into his driver card on the game. I'll bring my screen up for my test team at this moment, what this looks like. So what this essentially means is that the not classified penalty points applies. So this will apply, I would 100% expect, to his race score. So minus 20 right there. I also wonder if that also means a minus 5 in qualifying. Regardless of whether or not that minus 5 also applies, a minus 20 is a hefty enough penalty to absolutely, if you own Logan Sargeant, prioritize moving him out this weekend. Now, I appreciate for those of you that tried to capitalize on this loophole ahead of Monza and also double up on Colapinto seem to have been a bit hard done by, because obviously Colapinto, as opposed to being a 1-for-1 swap at 4.8 million, has now gone up 0.5 million after his great result in Monza. So obviously it not only makes a 1-for-1 trade harder, but also the fact that people are now going to have to manipulate other parts of their fantasy teams if they're doubled up on Sargeant and Colapinto. And that's exactly what this diagram is intended to help with, at least process, or going through the process and understanding what you could consider as part of making your transfers for this week. Now, I think if you've got 0.5 handy and you don't own Colapinto, the most obvious swap would be a Sargeant for Colapinto straight swap, which would be the two boxes on the left-hand side. But I think if you don't have that financial flexibility in your cost cap available, that becomes a little bit more problematic. And I think more often than not, people are at this point of the season likely pairing Sargeant up with one of these midfield drivers on screen here. So Hülkenberg, Gasly, Tsunoda, it could be Ocon, it could be Ricciardo, etc. I think given it comes in at around 15 million, it seems obvious enough to me that if you don't already own one of the Sauber drivers or Alex Albon, they seem like a very easy target to pair up with Colapinto if you don't own him too. Now, I think going for Albon as opposed to the Sauber duo makes the most sense to me. And why do I say that? I think because the upgrades that Williams rolled out in Zandvoort look the goods. Alex Albon made a Q3 appearance, and even though he started from the back of the pack on the Sunday, he did end up scoring in the Grand Prix. It was about 13 points, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, 13 points. So he had 8 overtakes and 5 positions gained, even though he got hit with that minus 15. Had he started the race from his qualifying position in Q3, I fully would have expected more points for Albon, and that very much proved to be the case in Monza again when he made another Q3 appearance starting from P9. And then, even though he did have only a couple of overtakes and finished P9, P9. I don't think it was necessarily a bad race at all. Williams typically have a good track record at Monza, and I think much like Ferrari, which we'll cover off later in the video, this translates nicely to another high-powered circuit like Azerbaijan, a lot of straights requiring very little downforce, and I think Albon's in the box seat for another position, another race where he can finish in a position with points for Williams. And I think Colapinto, again, embellishing more of that good form, a driver that started P18 in the Grand Prix last weekend and finished P12 with 6 positions gained and 5 overtakes to boot. So Williams, for me, if you can get to Albon Colapinto double up, are my pick of the bunch here. Then I think if you're having to work around budget flexibility or inflexibility, Bottas is my next favorite between him and his teammate. And I say that because in the last 6 races, we have to go all the way back to Spain. That was the last race Zhou outscored Bottas. And since that time, it's been more or less one-way traffic between the two of them for points and for price increases. You can see here Bottas has outscored his teammate in every single race. Zhou's obviously been hard done by a DNF in Belgium as well. But I think it goes to show that Bottas is a class above his own teammate. If we also pivot over to the price changes per race, even though both drivers, have gone down in price in every race since Canada, so Spain through to Monza, Zhou's obviously been much further off the back of the pack, and those points or price decreases and points have obviously resulted in his price currently being much lower than his teammates. So I would expect, again, both drivers to drop in price. If you're obviously in a situation where you can only get to one of the 2 Sauber drivers, my pick is Bottas, just because I think the likelihood of his price going down is much lower, and his point scoring potential of the 2 Sauber drivers, even though it is the worst car on the grid right now, slightly higher than his teammate. And then I suppose that leads us on to a situation where you might own Colapinto and Sargeant. And I think that creates a number of other different scenarios, which I don't think could be answered in a simple flowchart like the one we have on screen at the moment. So if I was to bring you back to my test team, which is currently ranked 1,000 overall, better than my actual team, you may have a team that looks something like this. I'm just going to do it for argument's sake. Let's call it a post-Monza team, where you'd have a double up on the Williams drivers, maybe a triple up on McLaren. You could have Sainz, Leclerc in this slot where Piastri currently is. You might be looking at your team for this weekend, not sure what to do next, and obviously not able to get to, let's say, a Sauber driver in one move cleanly. Now, I think the first priority for me would be, if you can do something like this, get Zhou in and an Albon or a Bottas, for example. I think that makes the most sense in 2 moves. But let's say instead you've got slightly lower budget and you're dealing with a situation where you may have these 2 drivers and Franco Colapinto and maybe not as much cost cap spare, then I would be looking at potentially having to downgrade, let's say, whatever driver you have in this slot where Piastri currently is. That probably for me would be a likely transfer from Piastri to Sainz potentially. If you're really stretched, then I would also argue maybe George Russell. But again, at that point, you're obviously a little bit hamstrung with budget. So I think there's a number of different ways you can skin a cat. But I think right now, Sargeant, regardless of what your team budget and team structure is, that if you own him, you should certainly be prioritizing Sargeant as a transfer out this weekend with that -20, as I alluded to. So a lot of moving parts this weekend. I think it's going to be, unfortunately, for people that own Sargeant, prioritizing him first and every other driver or constructor in their team second. And anyone that obviously doesn't own Sargeant probably have luxury transfers to take advantage of this weekend. So I will go now on to the next part of the video where we delve into the power rankings for this week. I have this segment every week, seems to be, I think, slowly becoming quite popular. So thank you to those who have, commented and said they like this segment. I think in the A tier, we're not going to spend a lot of time there because that's not where the moving parts for this week are. is, I think, Norris over Verstappen. Definitely my pick of the two there. I think McLaren have the best car on the grid. As long as Norris can hold on to first, assuming he qualifies on pole after the first lap, then I think he's in for a very good shot at winning the race. And equally Piastri too. I think he's shown in recent times that he's on top of his race pace. He's got a cool head on his shoulders, and he's not afraid to take it to Lando Norris either. I think if that first lap in Monza last race was anything to go by, Piastri certainly is not just on par with Norris or wants to prove that he's on par with Norris, but also at his price in the B tier, very good value based on what we're seeing from the McLaren so far. Going a little bit further down, I'd have Leclerc, a bit further up, but I just don't think the Ferrari's quite on the same level as the McLaren right now. And I think Hamilton, Russell feel like, for me, the odd men out because of the fact that McLaren looks so good. I think Ferrari deserve to be in the conversation at Azerbaijan. I mentioned before kind of that high-speed track that I expect the Williams to do quite well at, based on what we saw in Monza, much the same in Baku. I kind of expect Ferrari to have a similar translation of performance to the next couple races. Azerbaijan, Singapore, both very high-powered tracks. So I think you're looking at McLaren, you're looking at Ferrari, you're looking at Max Verstappen, and even Sergio Perez, who, to be fair, has not been in the fantasy conversation since probably the first 5 races of the season, does seem to have grabbed a few headlines lately. And I know the Red Bull right now is not what it was last season or in 2022, but you would be foolish to completely disregard the Mexican's performance at this track. He won there last season. He had a second place there in 2022, and then he won there again in 2021 in that title-winning car that Max Verstappen had. So to me, quite telling that he does have a soft spot for Azerbaijan. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see a top 5 or even him pushing for a podium at one point or another throughout the race. I do still feel like he is very much an outside chance, but do not write off Checo's performance in history at this track, because he is, on his day, a proven commodity, and we know he can win races at street circuits. Going down a bit further into the C tier asset class, the order has shaken up a lot since news of Sargeant and Bearman's place in the game was announced on Wednesday. And a lot of their standings in this tier list, to me, feel as though it's merely a product of a number of different factors. Let's start from the top, and then we'll get quickly into Ollie Bearman and Kevin Magnussen. Hülkenberg, I think, again, the top 3, top 5 on the C tier power rankings for me are only there because the likes of Magnussen, for example, isn't racing in Azerbaijan. And I wouldn't say there's a clear-cut best option. I think Hülkenberg, we know how good he is at qualifying. Albon, I've talked about. Ricciardo's been pretty hard done by lately with strategy from his team. You saw he racked up enough penalty points in Monza. You might confuse the guy with Esteban Ocon. And then I think Colapinto, at 5.3 million, an excellent budget enabler as well. Tsunoda, on the other hand, has fallen from grace a little bit. DNF in Monza, the only one there. And the V-Cub hasn't quite looked the part, despite the fact it was able to unlock quite a bit of performance in those earlier to middle stages of the season. So I've got the stock for Tsunoda falling slightly. Talked about Sauber. Let's get into Ollie Bearman and Kevin Magnussen. So I think the biggest takeaway from K-Mag's suspension in the game is not just because he won't be racing and won't have that kind of ability to gain budget or whatever it might be, but thanks to Adam from FanAmp Fantasy HQ has pointed out that K-Mag will also receive the -20 not classified penalty. Now, I don't own Kevin Magnussen. I'll just bring up my team, my test team right now. He's been removed from the game, as you can see here. So K-Mag is no longer here. But as far as I'm aware and from what I've been told, he has the same penalty applied to him that Logan Sargeant has. The driver inactive not classified penalty points apply. So if you own Kevin Magnussen and Logan Sargeant, they should be the 2 priority transfers for your team this week, because that's a -40 minimum that's incoming for both drivers. I do think, though, given that Bearman has been reinstated as a new asset, I call it a new asset, even though we did have him as a driver for Ferrari in Saudi Arabia. The fact that the developers have reinstated him at his Ferrari price of 15 million, to me, is such an obvious no buy for this week. I hazard a guess that because they have not been able to tweak the driver cards for existing names in the system. I don't know the complexities of what sits behind the game with the coding and the data engineering for F1 Fantasy, but the fact that they haven't been able to change his price to fit the car that he's driving in this weekend makes it so obvious to me that you should not consider Ollie Bearman in your teams. He's just not enabling your budget at all. There's a very low chance he gets driver of the day in that Haas, unlike the Ferrari he was driving earlier in the season. And it's also booking in a trade to remove him for Singapore as well. So I think there's just so many moving parts to make Ollie Bearman a clear avoid for this weekend. And realistically, I do think it kind of boils back down to going for some of these other midfield options that typically wouldn't be on the radar, like Albon, like Ricciardo, like maybe one of the Alpines as well. So obviously quite a few things happening this week that warrants some serious consideration for our teams. And it appears to me that constructors are probably luxury transfers this week if you've got one of Sargeant or Magnussen in your team for Azerbaijan. Moving on to my team and chip strategy for the week, DRS boost standout candidates for me have to be Lando Norris and Charles Leclerc. I talked about this a little in my team selection video, that even though it's not public or nothing has been said by McLaren, they have to be serious if they want Lando with the decent shot of winning the World Drivers' Championship. And to do that, team orders have to come into play to some effect. I know there's been talk around Oscar Piastri, who's managed by Mark Webber, famously a second driver at Red Bull when Sebastian Vettel won his World Championships. And I'm supposing Webber's in Piastri's ear saying you're not going to relinquish your first place to Lando Norris regardless of what the outcome is for the team. I think if McLaren are serious about putting Lando in the best position to win the World Drivers' Championship, they have to implement some degree of team orders. And I think for that reason, Lando Norris becomes a very popular 2x boost chip or 2x boost driver for Azerbaijan. I also like Leclerc. Talked about the fact that, again, maybe not team orders per se, but I think he has proven himself as the better of the two Ferrari drivers over the course of the season. Him and Carlos have at different points in time been evenly matched, but the fact that, Charles is averaging 25 points, Carlos is averaging 22.5 points per race, 2 to 3 points difference, it doesn't seem like a lot on face value, but I think the fact that Charles has outscored Carlos in the last 4 races is quite telling. So I do believe that, again, Leclerc and the performance of the Ferrari and Monza and that race pace suggests to me is going to be a popular option. I think Piastri, if you're looking for a differential, you're not happy with your rank, I wouldn't say no to throwing the 2x on Piastri for Azerbaijan. Coming into the chips, I think not really a weekend for any of them. I've only got the 3x and the final fix, and the only one I could realistically see myself using at any point between now and the end of the season where it's not planned for is the final fix. I think maybe no negative. Baku does eat up cars, a history of DNFs across the board for many teams. So if you do feel quite concerned about that high risk nature of a street circuit, then maybe think about throwing on the autopilot as insurance for your 2x or the no negative. But realistically, I don't think it's going to be a chip heavy weekend for me or for many people out in the F1 fantasy community. And I think now if we go back to my F1 fantasy team, this is my test team, the one that's doing so much better than my actual team. So we're not going to talk about my rank for my test team versus my actual team. But I think going back to what we've talked about already, this is kind of how I'm set up for this week. I do see myself either burning a transfer and rolling 3 into Singapore because there's very little I can do with 0.1 million. Or I could go down the path of making 2 driver transfers or a driver and constructor transfer. The driver transfers are a little more obvious to me. It would mean diverging from Lando Norris and bringing in Leclerc and Oscar Piastri. I could go with either of these 2 for my 2x if I went down that route. But I also don't mind having Lando Norris. He does feel like a set and forget 2x option, and having him in that slot, I just kind of know and expect that 25 to 30 points feels like an easy get for Lando at this point of the season based on the car and his driving. So I like the reliability of that. Sainz probably a little less certain about what his fantasy potential is, probably somewhere between 17, 18 points up to like the high 20s at most. I don't see him winning a race anytime soon, but I could leave it as that. If McLaren look objectively the best team in free practice, then a triple up does look possible for me, but it would mean having to run Mercedes in the constructor slot. So I think if you've got a bit more budget, a bit more liberty, I'd be running triple McLaren and Ferrari if you can get to here. The other option for me would be doing something about Zhou, but let's just refresh the team right now. There isn't really much I could do. Again, it would mean a downgrade to the constructor or a double up on the Sauber drivers, which again, I'm not overly pleased about. And I can't get to any other driver with Bottas in my team. I think that's just booking myself in for a price drop for at least two of these guys. And again, I'm not quite sure what to expect from Colapinto. I think he's a great asset and enabler to own, but Baku is a much trickier circuit than Monza, and I do suspect he will have his work cut out for him. Even for the best Formula One rookies, Baku does prove to be quite a challenging circuit to navigate. So quite a few decisions. I may end up burning a transfer if I'm happy with the team and rolling one of them in to Singapore, but that does seem a little passive. So we'll have to see what free practice delivers for us on Friday and Saturday. That's pretty much it for this week, guys. As always, check out my team selection if you need a few more ideas. But I will be back with the fantasy formula for another deadline stream 1 hour before qualifying. So be sure to drop by for a stream to dissect all of your last minute burning questions. Would be great to see you there if you've got nothing else to do before the qualifying on Saturday. But that's it for now, guys. Good luck with your teams this weekend, and I will see you all very soon.